Have you ever wondered what happens when a man's conscience finally breaks through years of complicity? What if I told you that buried in the dusty archives of Alexandria, Virginia, there exists a leather-bound ledger containing the names of over 3,000 enslaved human beings, their ages, their physical descriptions, their monetary values written in cold, meticulous handwriting, and yet, on one single page, page 47, there is nothing but empty space, no names, no descriptions, no values, just yellowed paper and silence. Tonight, I'm going to take you inside a story that historians have whispered about for over a century. A story about a man named Cornelius Whitmore, the most efficient slave cataloger the Price, Birch and Company trading house ever employed, a man who could appraise a human being's market value in under 30 seconds, a man who recorded the destruction of families with the same emotional detachment one might use to inventory grain shipments. But something happened to Cornelius Whitmore in the winter of 1864, something that made him leave that page blank. And what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about resistance, complicity, and the unbearable weight of moral awakening. If you're ready to discover what really happened in that Alexandria warehouse, stay with me until the end, because the truth about page 47 has never been told like this before. Hit that subscribe button now, because once you hear this story, you'll understand why some secrets refuse to stay buried. The brick warehouse still stands on Duke Street, though the tourists who pass it rarely stop to read the small bronze plaque affixed to its eastern wall. They don't know that the stains on the basement floor, scrubbed countless times over 160 years, still hold traces of human desperation in their molecular structure. They don't know that the iron rings embedded in the walls once held chains that bound mothers to daughters, fathers to sons, husbands to wives, for the last time before auction day separated them across state lines, across plantation boundaries, across the uncrossable geography of American cruelty. They don't know that on quiet nights, when Duke Street empties and the modern world retreats into sleep, the walls of that building seem to exhale a sound that those who have heard it describe not as a moan, not as a cry, but as a low, continuous vibration of accumulated grief, the sonic residue of 10,000 broken hearts compressed into red brick and wooden beams. Cornelius Whitmore knew that sound intimately. For 11 years, from 1853 to 1864, he served as the primary cataloger for one of the most prolific slave trading operations in the Upper South. His handwriting fills 17 leather-bound ledgers currently housed in the Alexandria Archaeological Museum, each page a monument to bureaucratic horror, each entry a human life reduced to height, weight, distinguishing marks, skills, temperament ratings, and estimated auction value. His script was elegant, almost beautiful, the letters formed with the precision of a man trained in classical penmanship, the ink applied with consistent pressure that never varied regardless of what he was recording. Whether documenting a 40-year-old field hand with a scarred back or a 3-year-old child torn from her mother's arms, Whitmore's handwriting remained steady, professional, detached. The trading house of Price, Birch and Company occupied a strategic position in the domestic slave trade's geography. Alexandria sat just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C., close enough to receive shipments from the declining tobacco plantations of Maryland and Virginia, positioned perfectly to funnel human merchandise south to the cotton and sugar operations of the Deep South that consumed enslaved labor the way fire consumes dry wood. The company's partners, Joseph Bruin, Henry Hill, and Solomon Price, had built an empire on efficient logistics and meticulous record-keeping. They prided themselves on documentation. Every human being who passed through their pens left a paper trail, a bureaucratic footprint that followed them into whatever hell awaited at their destination. Whitmore became their instrument of documentation, and for 11 years he wielded his pen like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away everything human about the people who stood before him and leaving only the data points that mattered to buyers: age, sex, height, weight, skin color gradations, evidence of childbearing capacity, signs of rebelliousness, scars from previous punishments, dental condition, muscle development, and a numerical value that transformed a human soul into merchandise. If you want to follow more cases like this one, cases that shake society to its core and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single investigation. The morning routine never varied. Whitmore arrived at the Duke Street compound at 6 o'clock, before dawn most months of the year, his leather satchel containing fresh ink bottles, replacement nibs for his pen, and the current ledger. He crossed the brick courtyard where, in warmer months, enslaved people were displayed for inspection, their bodies arranged like merchandise in a shop window. He climbed the narrow staircase to his second-floor office, a small room with a single window that looked out over the Potomac River, that boundary between the free state of Maryland and the slave state of Virginia that meant everything and nothing at the same time. From that window, on clear days, Whitmore could see the Capitol dome rising in the distance, the symbol of a republic founded on declarations of equality that had never applied to the people who filled his ledgers. He never commented on this irony. In 11 years of employment, according to every account that survives, Cornelius Whitmore never once expressed an opinion about the moral dimensions of his work. He catalogued, he documented, he recorded. He left each day at precisely 5 o'clock in the afternoon, walked home to his boarding house on Princess Street, ate his dinner alone, and read from his collection of Greek and Roman classics until sleep claimed him. On Sundays, he attended services at Christ Church, where George Washington had once worshipped, and he placed exactly 25 cents in the collection plate each week, never more, never less. His colleagues considered him strange but supremely competent. The traders valued his accuracy above all else. In 11 years, Whitmore never made a single error in his calculations. When he appraised an enslaved person at $800, that person sold for $800, give or take $10. When he noted that a woman was likely to bear 5 more children, she typically bore 5 more children. When he documented that a man showed signs of rebelliousness that would require breaking, that man required breaking. His eye was clinical, predictive, terrible in its precision. The enslaved people who passed through the Duke Street pens had different names for him. In the cramped holding cells where 40 human beings might share a space designed for 10, they whispered warnings about the thin white man with the dead eyes who would call them one by one into the small examination room on the first floor. They called him the weigher, not because of the physical scales he used, though he used those too, but because of the way his gaze seemed to measure the weight of a person's soul and find it convertible to currency. They called him cold hands because his fingers, when he examined their teeth or measured their limbs, carried no warmth, no human temperature, as if the blood in his veins had been replaced with something mechanical. They called him the bookman, because to be written in his book was to become property forever, your name transformed into a line item that could be bought, sold, traded, wagered, inherited, or discarded. What none of them knew, what nobody knew until the ledgers were examined by historians in 1923, was that Cornelius Whitmore kept a second set of records. Hidden beneath the floorboards of his boarding house room, in a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, lay 17 small notebooks filled with a different kind of writing. These notebooks contained no appraisals, no monetary values, no physical descriptions. Instead, they held fragments of stories. A woman named Sarah who could recite the entire book of Psalms from memory. A man named Marcus who had taught himself mathematics by counting stars and could calculate complex equations in his head faster than any white accountant. Twin girls, Mercy and Grace, who had been separated at age 6, one sold to Georgia, one to Louisiana, and who, according to the other enslaved people in the pen, could feel each other's pain across any distance. An elderly man named Solomon, who claimed to have been born free in Africa, who remembered the name of his village, who could describe the color of the river that ran through it, who had been captured at 17 and had spent 53 years in bondage, and who, when asked by Whitmore during his official cataloging what skills he possessed, had replied in perfect, dignified English, "I possess the skill of surviving your system." Whitmore had recorded that answer in his official ledger as field hand, limited skills, advanced age, value diminished. In his private notebook, he had written the response word for word, followed by 3 sentences that would haunt historians when they were discovered. He looked at me without hatred. That was worse. He looked at me with understanding. The private notebooks reveal a man conducting an archaeological excavation of his own conscience, layer by layer, entry by entry, cataloging not the market value of human beings, but their irreducible humanity. But for 11 years, this private archaeology remained entirely separate from his public function. Whitmore continued to serve the trading house with mechanical efficiency. His private scribbling changed nothing about the fates of the people he documented. Sarah was sold to a plantation in Mississippi, where she died of fever within a year. Marcus was purchased by a cruel master in Alabama, who had him whipped for uppity behavior when he corrected an overseer's arithmetic. Mercy and Grace never saw each other again. Solomon died in the Alexandria pen 3 weeks after his appraisal, his body disposed of in the pauper's cemetery without ceremony or marker. The private notebooks, in other words, were acts of witness without consequence, conscience without action, moral awareness without moral courage. Whitmore recorded the humanity he helped destroy while continuing to help destroy it. This is perhaps the cruelest form of complicity, the knowing kind, the kind that maintains meticulous records of its own participation in evil. And yet something happened in January of 1864 that finally transformed witness into action, that finally closed the gap between Whitmore's private conscience and his public function, that finally converted 11 years of passive documentation into one decisive moment of resistance that would save 23 human lives and cost Whitmore everything he had. The winter of 1864 arrived in Alexandria with unusual severity. The Potomac froze solid enough that a man could walk across it, though anyone who tried risked being shot by nervous sentries on both banks. The Civil War was entering its final bloody phase. Union forces controlled Alexandria and most of northern Virginia, but the slave trade, though officially suppressed, continued in shadowy forms. The Confederacy's need for labor had intensified as white men marched off to die in battles they were increasingly losing, and the underground traffic in human merchandise had actually increased, with traders like Price, Birch and Company operating through back channels, bribed officials, and the kind of paperwork manipulation that Whitmore's skills made possible. Leave a comment saying, "Never give up on truth," if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. In the second week of January, a new shipment arrived at the Duke Street compound. 23 enslaved people, collected from failing farms across northern Virginia, their owners preferring Confederate cash to the uncertainty of Union occupation. Among them was a family that would change everything. Elijah Washington, 42 years old, his wife Ruth, 38, and their daughter Hannah, 16. They had been sold by a man named Theodore Ashford, whose plantation near Fredericksburg had been stripped by both armies until nothing remained but debt and desperation. Whitmore conducted his standard intake procedures. He recorded Elijah as prime field hand, excellent physique, minor scarring on back from previous discipline, estimated value wanting $200. He recorded Ruth as domestic servant, skilled in cooking and sewing, evidence of 4 previous births, moderate health, estimated value $900. He documented Hannah's height, weight, skin tone, dental condition, and the particular detail that made young women valuable in certain markets: her physical attractiveness, her unblemished skin, her youth. What Whitmore's official ledger does not record, but what his private notebook describes in detail that still disturbs readers today, was what happened when he asked Hannah, as part of his standard intake, whether she possessed any special skills. She had looked at him, This 16-year-old girl standing in a cold brick room with chains around her wrists, about to be separated from her parents and sold into a fate she clearly understood. And she had said, "I can read, sir. I can write. I can do mathematics." My father taught me at night when the master was sleeping, using a stick in the dirt and then erasing the letters before morning. "I have read the Constitution of the United States, sir, and the Declaration of Independence, and I know that they were written by men who did not mean them to apply to me, but I also know that one day they will apply to me, because words have power that outlasts the men who write them, and the words, 'all men are created equal,' will eventually mean all men and all women, and even me." Whitmore's official entry for Hannah read, "Young female, domestic potential, pleasing appearance, premium market value $1,400. His private notebook entry for that moment spans 3 pages and includes this passage. "I have recorded the value of approximately 8,000 human beings in my years at this establishment. I have heard pleas, curses, prayers, and silence. I have watched mothers torn from children, husbands from wives, the elderly from the young who cared for them. I have maintained my composure through all of it. But when this child, this girl of 16, quoted the founding documents of our nation back at me as an accusation and a prophecy, I felt something inside my chest that I had thought long dead. I felt shame. Pure, perfect shame. And beneath the shame, stirring like a creature waking from hibernation, something else. Something that might, if I allow it, become conviction." The Washington family was scheduled to be separated and sold within the week. Elijah had attracted the interest of a cotton factor from Mississippi who needed strong field hands. Ruth had been earmarked for a domestic position in Richmond. Hannah had drawn the attention of a different kind of buyer, a man named Josiah Crane from New Orleans whose reputation preceded him, whose purchases of young women were understood by everyone in the trade to serve purposes that were never spoken aloud, that were simply accepted as one of the darker currents in an already dark river of commerce. Whitmore knew what awaited Hannah. He knew it with the same clinical precision that allowed him to predict auction values and childbearing potential. He knew it because he had recorded hundreds of similar transactions, had noted in his ledgers which buyers preferred which types of merchandise, had observed the patterns without ever allowing himself to feel their implications. But now, for the first time in 11 years, he could not separate his knowledge from his feeling. The gap between witness and participant, which he had maintained so carefully through thousands of entries, finally collapsed. For 3 nights, Whitmore did not sleep. He paced his small room on Princess Street, his private notebook spread across his bed, the accumulated testimony of 11 years of witnessed atrocity arranged in chronological order. He read through his own words, encountered the names and stories of people he had helped condemn, and experienced something that later documents describe as a comprehensive accounting, not of their lives, but of his complicity. On the 4th night, he made his decision. The plan that Whitmore conceived and executed over the following week demonstrated the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him so valuable to the trading house. He understood the bureaucratic systems of the slave trade better than anyone in Alexandria. He knew which documents were scrutinized closely and which were rubber-stamped. He knew which officials could be bribed and which were true believers in the cause. He knew the schedules of guards, the routines of traders, the gaps in surveillance that existed in any complex operation. And he knew, critically, the power of paperwork in a system that relied on documentation to transform human beings into property. What Whitmore created over those 7 days was a masterpiece of bureaucratic subterfuge. Using his position and his reputation for accuracy, he generated a set of false documents that would, if executed correctly, liberate the entire shipment of 23 enslaved people, including the Washington family, under the guise of a legal transaction. The documents claimed that all 23 individuals had been purchased by a Quaker abolitionist organization based in Philadelphia, operating through a legitimate front company that Whitmore invented entirely from his imagination, but supported with the kind of detailed paperwork that only an expert could fabricate. He created bills of sale, transfer authorizations, transit permits, and correspondence from fictional lawyers that explained the supposed buyer's preference for taking possession of the merchandise immediately, tonight, before final auctions could complicate the transaction. The forgeries were perfect. They had to be, because Whitmore knew that any error would not only doom the 23 people he was trying to save, but would expose his own involvement and destroy any chance of future resistance. He used authentic paper stock from the trading house supplies. He replicated the signatures of officials he had studied for years. He applied the correct seals, obtained through a combination of careful theft and wax impression copying. He even included the appropriate tax stamps, acquired through means his private notebooks declined to specify. The night of January 19, 1864, was moonless and bitter cold. The temperature had dropped below zero, and a sharp wind from the northwest cut through clothing like a blade. At 11 o'clock, when the trading house guards retreated to the warmth of their station room, Whitmore approached the holding cells with his sheaf of documents and a ring of keys he had duplicated over a period of 6 months. What happened in the next 3 hours has been reconstructed from multiple sources. Whitmore's own account, written years later, the testimony of survivors given to abolition societies after the war, military records, and the fragmentary physical evidence that remains in the Alexandria archives. The narrative that emerges is one of controlled chaos, of 23 terrified human beings following a man they had every reason to distrust into a darkness that might mean freedom or death. Whitmore entered the main holding cell at 11:17 p.m. He was carrying a lantern turned low, and his breath made small clouds in the frozen air. The 23 people inside had been sleeping in packed rows on the straw-covered floor, their body heat the only defense against the cold. They woke to find the man they knew as the weigher, the cold hands, the bookman, standing among them with papers in one hand and keys in the other. "I am going to remove your chains," Whitmore said, according to testimony recorded 20 years later by Ruth Washington, who survived to tell this story. "I have documents that will allow us to pass the checkpoints between here and the Potomac. On the other side of the river, there are people waiting to guide you north. You have no reason to trust me. Everything I have done in this place gives you reason to hate me. But I am asking you now, in this moment, to make a decision that could save your lives or end them. If you come with me, you might reach freedom. If you stay, you will certainly be sold south within the week. The choice is yours, but you must make it now, in the next 30 seconds, because the guards will return, and this chance will not come again." Elijah Washington was the first to stand. He looked at Whitmore for a long moment, then turned to the others and said, "We have been property all our lives. Tonight we become something else. What we become is up to us." 22 people rose to their feet. One man, an elderly field hand named Benjamin, who had been sold 14 times in 40 years, remained seated. "I am too old to run," he said. "I will only slow you down. Go, and God speed you, but leave me here. I have been running my whole life. Tonight, I choose to rest." Whitmore did not argue. There was no time. He unlocked the chains that bound the remaining 22 people and led them out of the cell, through the brick courtyard, past the window where he had spent 11 years looking out at the Capitol dome, through a side gate whose lock he had oiled the previous week, and into the frozen streets of Alexandria. The route to the Potomac had been planned with the same precision Whitmore applied to everything. He avoided the main checkpoints by using back alleys he had mapped over months of evening walks. He timed the passage past military patrols using schedules he had memorized. When they reached the waterfront, where a contact he had cultivated through abolitionist networks waited with a small boat, Whitmore produced his forged documents for a nervous harbor guard, who examined them briefly, asked one question about the buyer's representative, received a detailed answer that satisfied his curiosity, and waved them through. The crossing of the Potomac took 45 minutes. The water was not frozen here, where the current ran faster, but chunks of ice floated past the small boat, and the oarsmen, free black men from Maryland who had been running passengers north for years, fought against the cold that threatened to numb their hands. Hannah Washington sat in the bow, her parents on either side, her eyes fixed on the dark shore ahead. Whitmore sat in the stern, his face expressionless, his hands steady, his conscience, for the first time in 11 years, aligned with his actions. They reached the Maryland shore at 2:34 in the morning. A group of conductors from the Underground Railroad waited in the tree line, their lanterns shrouded to avoid detection. The handoff was quick and silent. 22 people who had been property 4 hours earlier disappeared into the darkness, headed north toward Philadelphia, New York, Canada, freedom. Whitmore did not go with them. "I must return," he told Elijah Washington in their final exchange. "If I disappear, they will know immediately that the escape was an inside operation. They will intensify the search, alert stations along the route, possibly recapture some of you before you reach safety. If I am at my desk tomorrow morning, conducting business as usual, they will assume the escape was accomplished by outside forces. They will look in the wrong direction. By the time they connect me to what happened, you will be beyond their reach." "You will be arrested," Elijah said. "You will be executed." "Probably," Whitmore agreed. "But I have recorded the names of 8,000 people in my ledgers. I have helped destroy 8,000 lives. 22 saved does not balance that account. It does not come close. But it is something. It is finally something." He crossed back to Virginia alone, re-entered Alexandria as dawn began to gray the eastern sky, and walked to his boarding house on Princess Street. He bathed, changed his clothes, ate a breakfast of bread and cheese, and arrived at the Duke Street compound at precisely 6 o'clock, as he had every working day for 11 years. The discovery of the empty holding cell triggered chaos that historians have reconstructed from court records and newspaper accounts. Guards were interrogated. Officials were summoned. The forged documents, discovered where Whitmore had left them with the harbor guard, were analyzed by experts who marveled at their quality while trying to identify their creator. For 3 days, the investigation focused on external infiltrators, abolitionist networks, Union military intelligence. No one suspected the quiet cataloger who continued to perform his duties with mechanical precision, who appraised new arrivals with his customary accuracy, who maintained his routine without variation. On the 4th day, Whitmore made an error. It was not a mistake in his forgeries or his planning. It was something simpler, something human, something that he perhaps intended subconsciously as a form of confession. When he opened his ledger to begin the day's entries, he turned past page 46, which contained the final records of the shipment that had included the Washington family, and he began writing on page 48. Page 47 he left blank. Later, when asked by investigators why he had skipped this page, Whitmore would reply, "Those people were never property. They were human beings who passed through this place and continued on to their destinies. There was nothing to record." This answer, recorded in the transcript of his trial, became his confession. The investigation that followed was brief and thorough. Whitmore's private notebooks were discovered beneath his floorboards. His correspondence with abolitionist contacts was traced. The full scope of his betrayal, not just the January escape, but a pattern of small resistances dating back years, tiny acts of document manipulation that had facilitated other escapes, was revealed. CTA. If you've watched this far, it's because you care about these stories that marked our nation forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. The trial of Cornelius Whitmore took place in March of 1864, in a courthouse that still stands in Alexandria's Old Town. The proceedings lasted 4 days and attracted coverage from newspapers across the divided nation. Northern papers portrayed Whitmore as a hero of conscience, a white man who had risked everything to save black lives. Southern papers described him as a traitor, a snake who had violated the trust of his employers and the laws of property. Neither portrayal captured the complexity that emerges from his private notebooks, the 11 years of complicity that preceded his single act of resistance, the thousands he helped condemn before he saved 22. The defense attorney, a young man named Charles Freeman who had been appointed by the court, argued that Whitmore had been temporarily insane, that the pressures of his work had broken his mind, that he could not be held responsible for actions taken during a period of mental incompetence. Whitmore refused this defense. In his final statement to the court, he declared, "I was not insane when I helped those people escape. I was sane for the first time in 11 years. What I did before, the cataloging, the appraising, the systematic documentation of human beings as merchandise, that was the insanity. What I did in January was the only rational act of my career." The verdict was guilty on all charges: theft of property, forgery of official documents, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their lawful possessions, and aiding the escape of enslaved persons. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. Whitmore received the sentence without visible emotion. According to witnesses, he nodded once, thanked the judge for a fair trial, and allowed himself to be led back to his cell without resistance. He spent his final weeks writing letters that were later collected and published by abolition societies, and completing a final notebook that contained not the stories of enslaved people, but his own reflections on complicity, conscience, and the terrible slowness of moral awakening. The most quoted passage from this final notebook reads, "I have asked myself 10,000 times why I waited so long, why I recorded the humanity of those I helped destroy without ever acting on what I recorded. The answer I have come to is this: it is easier to witness than to act. It is easier to document evil than to resist it. I wrote in my private notebooks as a way of preserving my conscience without risking my comfort. I told myself that by recording their stories, I was honoring their humanity. But recording is not honoring. The only way to honor humanity is to treat humans as human. Everything else is self-deception." The execution was scheduled for April 17, 1864. But history, as it often does, intervened in ways no one could predict. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee would surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, effectively ending the Civil War. But that was still more than a year away. In April of 1864, the war remained undecided, and Alexandria remained a contested border zone where Union and Confederate sympathies clashed daily. The morning of Whitmore's scheduled execution, a crowd gathered outside the jail, split between those who had come to see a traitor die and those who had come to witness a martyr's sacrifice. Northern newspapers had made Whitmore famous, and abolitionists from as far as Boston had traveled south to be present at his death. What happened next has been debated by historians for over a century. The official account states that a group of Union soldiers, acting without orders, stormed the jail and liberated Whitmore before he could be executed. The unofficial account, supported by evidence that continues to emerge from archived correspondence, suggests that the liberation was not as spontaneous as it appeared, that senior Union officers had quietly arranged the rescue as a propaganda victory, that Whitmore's escape was as carefully planned as his escape of the Washington family. Whatever the truth, Whitmore was freed from his cell at dawn on April 17th and spirited north by the same underground railroad networks he had helped support. He arrived in Philadelphia 3 weeks later, gaunt, exhausted, and transformed into a symbol that he had never sought to become. Abolition societies paraded him at rallies. Newspapers interviewed him extensively. His private notebooks were published as a book titled The Wearer's Conscience that sold over 50,000 copies and was translated into 7 languages. But Whitmore, according to those who knew him in his final years, never found peace with his celebrity. He refused to describe himself as a hero. When audiences applauded his escape work, he would redirect attention to the thousands he had helped condemn before he saved 22. When admirers praised his moral courage, he would speak about the 11 years of moral cowardice that preceded it. He became, in the words of one contemporary, a man haunted not by what he had done right, but by how long it had taken him to do it. After the war, Whitmore dedicated himself to locating survivors from his cataloging years, to documenting their fates, to providing whatever assistance he could to those who had somehow survived the system he had served. He worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping formerly enslaved people navigate the bureaucracies of freedom. He testified before Congress about the internal workings of the slave trade, providing evidence that was used to prosecute former traders and document the scope of the system's horrors. He never married. He lived simply, in a small room in Philadelphia, not unlike his old room on Princess Street, surrounded by his books and his guilt. The Washington family, whose rescue had triggered Whitmore's transformation, reached Canada safely in February of 1864. They settled in a community of escaped former slaves near Toronto, where Elijah found work as a carpenter and Ruth established a small school for black children. Hannah, the girl whose words about the Constitution had awakened Whitmore's dormant conscience, grew up to become an educator herself. After the war, she returned to the United States and established schools for freed people across the South, teaching literacy to thousands of men, women, and children who had been denied education under slavery. In 1879, Hannah traveled to Philadelphia to meet the man who had risked everything to save her family. Whitmore was 63 years old, his hair white, his health failing, his eyes still carrying the distant look that witnesses from all periods of his life described. The meeting lasted 4 hours, and neither participant ever fully described what was said. But one exchange was recorded perhaps by Hannah herself, and has been preserved in the archives of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Hannah asked, "Do you regret the 11 years before you saved us?" Whitmore replied, "Every day. I will regret them until my death, and if there is judgment afterward, I will regret them then. But I have learned that regret without action is worthless, and action after regret is still valuable. I cannot undo what I did before January of 1864, but every day since then, I have tried to make the scales balance a little more. They will never balance completely, but the trying matters." Hannah said, "When I was 16, standing in that cold room with chains on my wrists, I told you that words have power that outlasts the men who write them. You wrote in your ledger that I was merchandise. You wrote in your private notebook that I was human. Both sets of words have outlasted the moment they were written, but only one set is true. I am here, alive, free, teaching others to read and write, because you finally chose to act on the words that were true." Whitmore died in Philadelphia in 1884 at the age of 68. His death was noted in newspapers across the country, and his obituary struggled, as all accounts of his life have struggled, to reconcile the man who catalogued 8,000 human beings as property with the man who risked death to save 22 of them. The blank page, page 47 in his final ledger, became the symbol of this contradiction, the empty space that represented either his redemption or the inadequacy of his redemption, depending on who was interpreting it. The ledgers themselves passed through various hands after the war, eventually coming to rest in the Alexandria Archaeological Museum, where they remain today. Visitors can view them under glass, the elegant handwriting preserved, the monetary values still legible, the lives reduced to data points still readable after 160 years. Page 47 is displayed separately, mounted under its own glass case with a small placard that explains its significance and quotes Whitmore's answer to the investigators. "Those people were never property." Historians continue to debate Whitmore's legacy. Some argue that his final act of resistance cannot atone for his years of complicity, that the 22 he saved cannot balance the thousands he helped condemn, that his private notebooks represent a form of moral self-indulgence, a way of feeling good about himself while continuing to participate in evil. Others argue that Whitmore's story illustrates the possibility of moral awakening at any stage of life, that his transformation from complicit bureaucrat to active resistor offers hope for anyone trapped in systems of oppression, that even late action is better than no action at all. But perhaps the most profound interpretation comes from the writings of Hannah Washington herself, who in her later years became an essayist and lecturer in addition to her work as an educator. In a piece titled "The Blank Page," published in a Philadelphia newspaper in 1892, she wrote, "I have spent much of my life teaching people to read and write. I have seen the power of literacy to transform lives, to open doors, to create possibilities that did not exist before. But I have also seen the power of words to destroy, to categorize, to reduce human beings to entries in ledgers." Cornelius Whitmore spent 11 years using the power of writing to destroy lives. He then spent 20 years using the power of writing to try to repair some of the damage. The blank page that he left in his ledger, the page where our names should have appeared as property, represents a choice. He chose not to write. He chose to leave that space empty because he finally understood that some things should not be recorded, some lives should not be catalogued, some human beings should not be reduced to words on a page. The blank page is not an absence, it is a presence. It is the presence of 22 human beings who refuse to be merchandise. It is the presence of a man who finally refused to make them merchandise. It is the presence of choice in a system designed to eliminate choice. Every time I see a blank page now, I think of what could be written on it and what should not be written on it. And I remember that the most important act of writing is sometimes the decision not to write at all. The warehouse on Duke Street still stands. The tourists still pass without pausing. The Potomac still flows between the free and the enslaved, though those categories no longer apply. The ledgers rest under glass, and page 47 remains blank, a rectangle of yellowed silence that speaks more loudly than all the words that surround it. In the basement of the Alexandria Museum, stored in climate-controlled archives rarely accessed by the public, there is a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth that was recovered from beneath the floorboards of a Princess Street boarding house in 1923. Inside the box are 17 notebooks filled with handwriting identical to the handwriting in the official ledgers, but containing different information entirely. These are the stories of Sarah and Marcus, of mercy and grace, of Solomon who remembered the name of his village, and of thousands of others whose humanity Whitmore recorded while helping to destroy their lives. The final entry in the final notebook, dated the night before Whitmore was captured in 1864, reads, "Tomorrow I will walk to my office as I have walked every day for 11 years, but I am no longer the same man who made that walk yesterday. I have seen what I am capable of becoming when I finally choose to become it. I have seen that it is possible to act on conscience, even after years of acting against it. I do not know if I will survive what comes next, but I know that the blank page in my ledger will remain blank, and that somewhere to the north, 22 people are walking toward freedom because I finally understood what I should have understood from the beginning. That they were never mine to catalog, never anyone's to sell, never property but always human beings with the same right to liberty that I have taken for granted my whole life. May whatever God exists forgive me for taking so long to see it, and may the words I have written, both the terrible ones and the true ones, serve as testimony for those who come after. The testimony has served, the words have endured, and the blank page still speaks, a century and a half later, to everyone who pauses long enough to hear what silence can tell us about the choices we make and the choices we fail to make, until, perhaps, it is almost too late to make them at all. Like this video if the story of Cornelius Whitmore and the Washington family touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of those who resisted and those who finally chose to help them resist will never be forgotten.